Hello, it's Angela, and welcome back to Literature Science Alliance for another installment of Science Behind the Magic. Now, I just wanted to also start off by saying I am so sorry if there is extraneous creaking or mumbling or car sounds or the train or construction, because apparently when you're home all the time, all these noises just happen. And I have tried to pick a time where construction's not going on and my neighbors are quiet, but that's also the exact time when dogs bark. So, just we're all in this together. But that doesn't make me less excited about the video I plan to share with you today. So, if for those who are new, I have a bachelor's degree in physics and I'm pursuing a PhD in biophysics, which means I'm a nerd and I really love science, but also you're here because I love books. So occasionally I like to take a concept from a book I like, whether that's fantasy or sci-fi, and really extrapolate on that concept to try and for myself learn something cool, but then also give that information to you guys. It takes a lot of work, which is why I don't do it super often, but I love to teach. It's kind of one of my goals and drives, so that's why I put this series together. And if you probably noticed from the title today, we're going to go into electricity power, shocking powers, lightning bolts, things like that. At least one aspect of it, because obviously electricity is a huge field, and it's just something we need to look at a tiny piece of. So, for those of you who don't know what I read or like, I actually came to this idea from reading A House of Earth and Blood, which I read last month? I don't know, time's weird now. But I read it last month, and in it there's a character, Hunt, who has electricity angel magic, which is pretty cool. And then I was watching Avatar Last Airbender, and firebenders in that world, they can do lightning, either redirection or power. That's really cool. And so I was thinking, so how would that actually work? And then I remembered I'd read this dystopian last year called The Power. And this is supposed to be kind of what people marketed as Handmaid's Tale on its head. And it's a world where suddenly women have this new organ that lets them have power over electricity. And so it's kind of how this, it was a world like ours where it is more male power, right? Patriarchy. And flipping that on its head, what happens when the other gender suddenly has this new power dynamic? Now, in that book, they explain it a little more scientifically, as in women got this organ similar to what is in electric eels. So I was like, that's something that's been studied. That's something I can really dig into. And I found out a lot of cool things. So we're going to look at this through the lens of what if these magical creatures maybe had a physiology similar to an electric eel, and maybe that's why they have these electric powers and are able to do what they do. Just, a fun thought exercise. So let's just get into it. Now, the first thing you have to know is, what is electricity? I feel like we all know what it is, we all have an electric bill, but just for the sake of everyone being on the same page, it is what happens when electrons, these very small negatively charged particles, are traveling through a conductive element. And through that traveling, it provides power, which is how, this camera and light are working on me right now. So that's what electricity is. And what an electric shock is what happens when you go from having a situation where there's insulation. So that means there's no conductivity. So right now, there's nothing producing electricity between me, between my two hands. There's nothing happening there because air is a really good insulator, which means it doesn't, allow for electrons to go between the two. Now, when you have static shock or lightning bolts, that's what happens when suddenly there is a strong enough, it's called an electric field, which we don't need to go into in too much depth, but when that becomes strong enough that suddenly the air is no longer an insulator, it's conductive. So when we suddenly go from an insulating environment with no current to conductive where there is a current, we get an electric shock because of that sudden change. It has to be pretty much like a flip of the switch sort of thing. And so that's, the idea of what an electric shock is. And I think it's important to understand that before we go into some more physics, biology details, which I do geek out a lot about, so bear with me. Also, I do try to format these so that anyone can consume them, but I also am a scientist who is very much familiar with the jargon, so If at any point I get a little over your head, that's my bad, not your bad. Don't feel disconnected. Ask me a question down below and I will get back to you ASAP, all right? So just wanted that caveat out there. No one should feel dumb while listening to me. If you're feeling dumb, I did something wrong. Back to the power. The idea is these women had this organ that they called it the sock organ, but that's the wrong one as I was doing research. There's actually a hunter organ in the eel. It doesn't really matter. They have these 3 organs, and that's how they produce like from 10 to 600 volts. That's a lot of volts. Like that's enough. It's like a stun gun. I mean, you could maybe die from something like that. It depends. And they do this because they have a special cell type. So you know, our body's made of a lot of different types of cells. I mean, we know there are skin cells, heart cells. I feel like we all conceptualize that there are different parts of our bodies, and they're made up of cells, and there are different types of cells that do different things, right? So the eel has a specific cell type that's called an electrocyte. Now, you know, that kind of implies electricity, right? And what it actually is so we have muscle cells. This is like a muscle cell that's been turned into, instead of moving like how muscle cells move to help us all move, to actually just become batteries to produce electricity and allow that charge to go down. So yeah, they have like 200,000 electrocytes, and that's important because of what we're going to go into. Now these are little discs. They're aligned like a battery. So when the average person, right? Well, me at least. I look at a battery as a plus and minus side. I know when I put in my remote, I have to line it up correctly or else the current won't go, the remote won't work. And that's because it has that polarity of a minus side and a positive side. So when we're talking about comparing these cells and these stacks of cells to batteries, that's what we're kind of looking at. Because of what happens, because of how they're activated, everything becomes polarized. Because initially, the cell is just negatively charged overall. It just has a negative charge because of where ions are. If you don't remember from chemistry class, ions are just things that have a positive or negative charge that are singular elements on that periodic table. That's all we need to know here. But because of the distribution of ions in our body and the environment, cells are typically negatively charged. They have a negative, it's called a membrane potential, which is synonymous to the voltage you would read on a battery. That's what that means. So what happens is when these cells get activated, they act like a battery. And they act like a battery that has like 600 volts, and it's really cool. But how do we go from this negatively charged cell that's not producing a current to producing a current, which is, again, what we said an electric shock is, going from an insulating environment to a conductive environment? How are we doing that? Well, it's similar to how a lot of cells interact with our environment. Your brain, when it wants to send a signal, it will send what's called a neurotransmitter. And it literally sounds like what it is. It is a, neuron. Neurons are brain cells. It is a small particle that will transmit a signal. That's what it does. So it goes to these electrocytes and it tells it, turn on. What does turn on mean? It means it opens a channel. And this channel allows for those ions we were talking about to move. And because of how it moves, if you see here on the diagram, you have specifically sodium ions that are going to move into the cell and cause one side of it to become positively charged. And because of that, potassium will leave the cell, and that end of it, where potassium is leaving, will become negatively charged. So see, now it has this polarity, a positive and a negative, which makes it act like a battery. And what's interesting is each individual electrocyte only produces a small voltage. But if you combine them all in series like this, it becomes cumulative, and the way it's set up is so that they all are told to activate at the same time. And that's how it produces an electric shock. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. In a nutshell, that's what's happening. And I obviously could geek out and go into more detail, but I don't want to get in the weeds. There's a lot going on here, and it's all kind of fresh for me because I'm actually TAing a physiology of cells course right now. That's part of the inspiration behind this, if I'm being honest. So yeah, that's really what happens. And I just think that's cool, and I think that could be what's happening if we had magical characters, that they had these cell setups. If they're doing it through their hands, why couldn't their fingers just have little stacks of these cells? It could be a thing. I don't know. I'm a dork. Well, that's it. Any of these images here were actually made again by my friend Alyssa, and I will link her Instagram page below, which has links to her Etsy's. She's great at digital art. She's actually pursuing a degree with scientific art, and I'm just so appreciative that when I'm like, hey, do you have time to like draw me a depiction of this, she just always goes out of her way to do that for me, and I really appreciate it. But yes, comment if you have questions, critical critiques, any cool ideas you have. Just, if I did explain something wrong, feel free to correct me. I feel like everything I said is pretty truthful, but I don't know, sometimes my words get muddled, and I definitely don't. I would rather be corrected than, stay wrong. Just seems weird. So I hope you guys are having a great day, and talk to you next time. Bye.